My name is Taniqua Hughley. I am a graduate of the class of 2015 and 2017 as well, so I'm a double band. And so today's panel, we're going to look at the context of coeducation, what was happening here at Trinity and across the world at that time. And I have the pleasure of interviewing or moderating a panel for four wonderful people who impacted the college and has great history about what was happening 50 years ago. So I would like to welcome our panelists to the stage, please.
I came to Trinity from Smith and really did not anticipate at all the kind of pivotal experience that I would have, and that I would stay, and that I would never leave. So, but I came, the draw for me was the dance program, which had started as the reason for dance at Trinity. It was introduced so that, because it was thought that it would be good for women. So it didn't have too much of a larger artistic sort of introduction of itself, but nonetheless, a really wonderful dancer whose name was Clive Thompson and his wife came and sensational dancer, and really started the whole thing going. And as much as it was something that was introduced for women, the classes were predominantly filled with men who had never thought of themselves and ever walking into a studio and being a dancer, but all of a sudden thought of that. And several of those men became dancers, went on to study at the Hartford Ballet and other places. So it was really interesting in that way. But I think for me, you know, I had been at an all-women's institution. I had felt the need to really be in a more mixed environment. I'd gone to public high schools my whole life, and I don't think I completely understood the ratio would be that much different when we got there, because there were four of us, as you could see in the film. But I think that every one of us had a sense of being in a time of huge change. I think that one of the things, and one of the reasons that I really wanted this panel to happen, was that I think that that year was a formative year for me, in the sense of the Trinity gave the opportunity, because there was an open curriculum. There was so much of emphasis on individual voice, and that and I think campuses across the country were seeing this surge in student activism. The war was happening. There was a lot of protests about racial imbalances and inequalities, and efforts to bring that forward in new and important ways. Urban studies and environmental studies, this was a time, a current of people talking about it and wanting it and demanding it. So students really did make a difference. Their voices were heard. And I think that within the war was happening and classes were canceled so that students could protest the war. The graduation that you saw, the picture with two of us not wearing robes, was part of an effort to give money that you could have given for your robe to the anti-war effort. So there was a sense of possibility that, for me, carried on in my entire career at Trinity. I think that as a woman, my experience, and the four of us that were the seniors of that class had a very different experience than freshmen, who were really looking at being at Trinity for the long haul, and for their long haul of college. And I think that in that sense, the college had some catching up to do, because Trinity was one of the first that invited women, but I think in some ways needed to prepare itself after the fact for what that really meant. And I think it took some time to do that, but I think over time it was addressed. But I think that to be a woman at that time was to feel that we were really carving a path. In a sense, I felt like I was coming from another planet, because there was just this sense of not very many of us around in classes. Sometimes there was an uncomfortability amongst professors that a woman would, oh, I forgot a woman was here. And so there was this kind of adjustment in style that happened, I think. But I want to also emphasize that the open curriculum, which didn't last, it sort of gradually went to more and more requirements. But I think that that was an amazing idea, of not having requirements and really looking to the motivation of individuals, of students, to find what they were interested in and really go for it. And to me, that was like nirvana in college. You know, I was really ready to do independent work, and I was motivated to do that and found professors that were incredibly willing to. My advisor is sitting 2 people right out at the end of this table, and was one of the people that allowed me to do my thesis, which was an American Studies thesis. American Studies wasn't yet here, but was able to approve an interdisciplinary major in American Studies. And so the opportunities to really connect to the community, I mean, some of the things that we see happening at Trinity now, of the strong connection that's happening with the Hartford community, really started, I think, there, of seeing the possibility of going out and not keeping the college distant from the city, but in fact, including the city in what Trinity was about. And I think that all of that started there. Andy Goldis here from Urban Studies really was fighting all those years for really a recognition of that. And so, oh my goodness, that's my signal. Is that a minute or is that it?
That's it, but go ahead.
That's it. Well, I'm really almost done. I really saw myself as being the shortest speaker of all. So in any case, I think that what that year, I think women were such an important part of that year and have been in the history since then. And that we need to look at the year itself and what it was about as a kind of legacy for coeducation, for innovation, of taking risks, of going outside the box, and of really supporting the things that are the most and seemingly peripheral. Dance was certainly one of those, and it's now thriving and well. The arts have really grown at the college, and it's been beautiful to see that. So I think I will now pass this on to my colleagues. Thank you.
Give a round of applause. So Ron Spencer, class of 64, is the former associate academic dean and lecturer in history. Spencer taught courses in U.S. history and occasionally American studies from 1968 until 2010. His primary interest is the antebellum and Civil War periods. He also held a succession of administrative positions between 1971 and 2008 as a dean of students, dean of studies, special advisor to the president, and for 28 years, associate academic dean. Since retiring, he has published a book on the wartime diary of Gideon Welles, Lincoln Secretary of the Navy, and taught in Trinity's Academy for Lifelong Learning and the University of Connecticut's Adult Learning Program. Please give a round of applause to Mr. Ron Spencer.
Thank you. That was, someone once said, that's the kind of introduction that my father would have enjoyed and my mother would have believed. Or maybe it's the reverse, but however, I appreciate it anyway. Let me say a little bit about the background to coeducation at Trinity. There were lots of schools that were considering it in the period from the very late 60s into the very early 70s. During that period, no fewer than 4 Ivy League institutions became coeducational. Brown, Dartmouth, Yale. I've left one out. It'll come to me. At the same time, here at Trinity, there were important changes afoot. The Princeton, how can I forget Princeton? Almost went to Princeton, but decided to come to Trinity instead. That was the 4th Ivy. And then there were, of course, a number of colleges, more or less of Trinity's type, that were also considering becoming coeducational. I won't name all of them, but you've heard of all of them. The other thing that was going on at Trinity was that there was a growing interest in expanding the campus. Would you believe there were 10 new buildings that opened between 1960 and 1969? Where the money came from, that's above my pay grade. And the faculty was growing, particularly during President Jacobs' tenure, which was from 1953 to 1968. The faculty grew from about 83 people to a little over 130 people. So that's a big growth in a 15-year period. And the student body was also growing. The ideal, quote unquote, ideal size for the student body was set by President Funston right after World War II as 575 students. Under President Jacobs, it grew to 1,000, and shortly before the trustees began to contemplate coeducation, the trustees directed the president between 1965 and 1970 to increase the size of the student body from the existing 1,000 to 1,250. So clearly there was a lot going on here, but why coeducation? Well, as best I can tell, of course there must have been multiple reasons, but I think the central reason was that increasingly the quality of the entering student body and of the larger pool from which the student body was drawn was diminishing. The quality and quantity were diminishing. By 1968, if I remember correctly, the number of applicants had fallen by several hundred compared to a few years prior to that time. But equally important, the reading was, on the part of people in admissions and elsewhere, that the quality of many of those applicants was significantly lower than the quality of classes a few years earlier. And so it seemed to make sense, and this was not unique to Trinity, far from it, to consider how to expand the student body and how to increase the quality of the pool. And of course, that's what coeducation was supposed to do and what coeducation did. And it's interesting that in 1973, the first fully co-ed class, that the number of male applicants, which had been stuck around 1,500 a year, the number of male applicants shot up to 1,700, and soon thereafter was heading toward 2,000. And then, of course, when you add the women into the pool, it wasn't long before about 3,000 people were seeking admission to Trinity, which was vastly greater than anything in the pre-coeducational period. Final thing, and she's going to buzz me if I don't make this pretty concise. I think one of the things that most impressed me about Trinity when I was a student, and then during my long and varied career as a faculty member and an administrator, is that in some ways it is very conservative. It tends to, or at least historically, it tended to look very skeptically upon anything that would be called a fundamental change. But happily in 1968-69, when change was really important, it rose to the occasion. It's extraordinary. When you think sometimes it took presidents and trustees years to agree on minor things, that in the space of a few months, they had decided this place was going to become coeducational. It was really, it's one of the more remarkable events in our history. And I would say in closing that I think the only thing more important than the adoption of coeducation in the entire history of the college was its founding in 1823. On that note, I'll yield to the next person.
Randy Lee. Randy Lee is a class of 1966. He is the Associate Professor of Psychology and the Director of the Counseling and Wellness Center here on campus. At Trinity, since 1969, Lee teaches courses in psychotherapy theory, mind and body health, and clinical psychology, and conducts workshops and seminars in mindfulness and meditation. He has published in the areas of meditation and eating disorders and founded the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior, which he edited from 1976 to 1986. Lee has served as president of the Connecticut Psychological Association from 1977 to 78. He is a member of the National Council of Representatives of the American Psychological Association from 1982 to 1985. He was the chair of the Ethics Committee of the Connecticut Psychological Association from 1990 to 2014. He is also an assistant coach and sports psychologist for the Trinity women's squash team. Please give a round of applause to Mr. Randy Lee.
And the women's squash team is number 3 in the nation, and the national championships are next weekend on our courts, so you should all be there. I'm going to take just a little bit of a different perspective and talk more about student life, particularly as it affects psychology. And I think that the number of changes and the change in the nature of psychology of students changed dramatically around the time of coeducation. The counseling center itself was only 6 years old when I came, and I came actually the same time Judy came. I came in 1969, so this is my 50th year, but I was only 4 years old when I started, so just so you get the right idea. And at that point, obviously in 69, with as few women as we had at that point, the entire counseling center consisted of 2 white males, which I'm not proud to say it remained that way until 1999 when we hired our first person of color and first woman, and that began to change to the point where now the minority in the counseling center is me. We have 8 women and me, so we're not underrepresented. In those early days, when it was just George Higgins and myself, we saw about 12% of the student body in the course of the year. And much of our work during those early years really is probably best described by the title of a talk I gave to Grand Rounds at the Institute of Living some years ago. And the talk was called From Tree Huggers to iPodders. Probably if I were to redo that talk, I would have to make it From Tree Huggers to iPhoners at this point, since iPods are not even around anymore. But the tree hugging was symbolic, I think, and I think it represented a number of things. In some ways, it represented a kind of loneliness that I think many of our students felt, because many of the reasons they were out on the quad literally hugging trees. I'm not being metaphorical. They were hugging those Dutch elms. Maybe that's why the Dutch elm disease, took over so quickly. But they were trying to connect with something that they didn't feel. One other just quick aside that I don't want to forget to mention, one of the highlights of my early years here that relates to Judy is that she and I, in probably 1973, taught a course together in dance therapy, which was the first time I'd ever taught a course jointly, and it was wonderful. She would deal with the dance pieces, I would deal with the psychology pieces, and we hired a dance therapist who came up every week from Yale to get us moving. And that's part of when Judy and I began to become very close friends, which we have been for 50 years, even though we both started before, right? I think the effects of becoming coeducational on the psychology of students in general is a product of several forces. One of them clearly is bringing women in, because psychology of women does have differences from the psychology of men. But there were other forces. The beginnings of the so-called sexual revolution in the 1960s certainly had a powerful effect on changing some of the relationship patterns, and it's impossible, I think, to fully sort out those differences. The presence of women on campus did change the dynamic. It's hard to put your finger on it, but the nature of the relationships between men and women on the campus was never the same. There were other changes too. It's no secret that it was also in the late 60s that there was a little bit more widespread use of substances of an illegal nature. In fact, I remember when I graduated in 1966, I literally knew no one who had ever smoked marijuana. I came back for homecoming that fall of 66, and that was no longer the case. So there were a lot of things going on. And finally, as one other piece to this whole thing that I think makes it hard to parse all of it out, is the state of the nation, as the wonderful video tried to demonstrate. because we had, particularly in 1968, we had the King murder, the Kennedy murder, assassination, the Columbia protests, which emerged particularly around the protests around the Vietnam War. We had increasing racial tension. I didn't even realize, although I'm sure you did this, the historian, that part of what triggered some of those Columbia protests was that Columbia was going to build a segregated gym on the campus in 1968. But
Randy, it was not on the campus, it was in a public park, and that's what made it really objectionable to the residents of Harlem.
Okay, good, thank you. So all of those things, I think, were part of what was going on, and it was also, in terms of activism and activating our students, 1968 was the only time, to my knowledge, that our students led a major protest of their own, sitting in on the trustees for 2 days. That's 5 minutes. I'm going to go 2 more minutes because everybody else did too. I just want to say that when I teach that psychotherapy course, and one of the things I tell the students is that patterns of psychotherapy parallel patterns of social change. I think I would amend that, or not amend it, but add to that for this kind of a context, and say that patterns of psychological interaction parallel patterns of social change. There is a difference in the way people interact when we're dealing with a very conservative national government as compared to a more liberal national government, and I think that changes a lot of things too. The other thing, we went from seeing 12% of the students in my early years to gradually up to the point where we now see almost 40% of the students every year. And the proportion there is about 60-40 female. That does not mean that the women at Trinity are more emotionally disturbed than the men. Quite the contrary, it means that women have the self-empowerment and the willingness to kind of say, hey, I need some help with some things I'm struggling with. So we had to adapt. We had to find new ways to address the kinds of growing problems that were happening. We had to find ways to allow students to make the most out of their education and yet still provide some way for them to function effectively on the campus without having to but send home or otherwise find other alternatives for many others. So there have been lots of other changes. I won't go into them many more. We've developed a lot of new methods for the way we work with students. And the exciting thing for me, and the reason I'm still here after 50 years, is every day and every year is new. Every set of problems, every individual brings to my office a new way of telling me what's going on in their life. And so it's so exciting for me to have to kind of say, all right, well, this is different from, when Ron Spencer came into he never came into my office. He's older than me.
And last but not least, I would like to introduce Miss Dory Katz. Dory Katz was a professor of modern languages and literature. Katz joined the Trinity faculty in 1969 when she first taught French and comparative literature in what was then the Department of Modern Languages and Literature. She also served as acting chair of the department. She was the first woman to receive tenure at the college. Katz is a Jewish Holocaust survivor who has published a memoir, Looking for Strangers, the true story of my hidden wartime childhood. About her childhood years in Belgium. The book has been called absolutely compelling, both deeply personal and historically important. Katz has translated several books from French and is also a poet. Her most recent collection of poems is Hiding at Other People's Houses. Please give a round of applause to Ms. Dory Katz.
I guess I'll talk more about what it was like 50 years ago, and you can make the comparison of what it's like today. I came to interview for the job in the spring of '69. There were no women around, but everybody assured me, don't worry, we're going co-ed. When you get here, it'll be co-ed. And naive that I was, I thought that would be the case. To my surprise, when I came in the fall of 1969, there were very few women here, few women students. There were almost like maybe 6 women faculty, and my office partner, Uta Sen, and I were the only 2 tenure track faculty member. I thought I had been dropped in a boys' high school. Just sort of, there were, by the way, spittoons in the faculty lounge and portraits of all the men who had been president and associated with the college. My classes were great. I liked the students very much. Most of my students, of course, were male, which over the years teaching French was unusual. I thought they were terrific. I also thought the other faculty members, most of them were very welcoming, especially the younger faculty member. But the problem was I was asked to serve on 2,000 committees because they wanted a woman's voice. And I also found out something not so pleasant, that a member of my department who had been hired at the same time was making much more money than I was. And did not, and I already had some publications when I came. And so when I went and complained about it, I was told, I'm not exaggerating, of course, he's a man, and he's married and has children, while you are a woman unmarried. It stands to reason. Anyway, that was one of the things. So the other faculty, besides being burdened by committee work, mostly were very welcome. The most difficult part for me, frankly, was the way the administration operated. Those were the days before emails, so most of the communications were through letters, or my mailbox was always stuffed. Everything addressed to Mr. Katz. And I was often asked to bring my wife to certain events. And by the way, that was before gay marriage was legal. So the fact that Mr. Katz was asked to bring his wife, was a sign of, I felt in a way very visible and in a way very invisible. The story also goes, I was housed in Seabury. There were no women's bathroom in Seabury's. But there were many secretaries who were women, but we all had to put on our coats and gloves and hats and go to Matter Hall if we wanted to use the facilities. When they finally built a ladies' room, I'm 5'2", I'm not exactly a midget, but I'm not very tall. The mirrors were so high I couldn't see myself. So sort of I do have a story that perhaps I have time to tell. As you know, the fraternities used to invite faculty for dinner, and afterwards they would introduce them, and we would say a little speech. And I went there with two colleagues, one in the English department and one in economics. This was in 1970. And my colleague in the English department after dinner was introduced as Professor Dr. Robenshaw. And he got up and said, thank you very much, but it's Mr. I don't have my PhD yet. And then my colleague in economics was introduced as Dr. I think Garsto. And he got up and said, thank you very much, but it's Mr. I don't have my PhD yet. And so I was introduced as Miss Katz. So I got up and said, thank you very much, but it's Dr. Katz. I do have my PhD. The one thing I do need to mention, which seems strange, was the reaction of some women on campus towards me. It was mixed, especially my reception by the faculty wives. Now, some of them were obviously very happy to have a woman on the faculty, but some didn't quite get what my role was, and they asked me to join their book club. You know, I'm teaching 6 courses, 4 of them were literature courses, and I told them, you know, I can't quite do that. And they sort of were very nice to me, but I sort of have to keep insisting, I am not a faculty wife. I am the faculty. But I think in time, as more and more faculty, women came, and more co-eds came, things really changed. And today, I think this Trinity that you see today has very little relationship to, I hope, to the Trinity of 1969, when naive me came and expected everything to be truly co-ed. Thank you.
Please give another round of applause to our panelists.